Recording now?
It's in the process. Yes, it's fine.
Yes, it's fine.
Okay.
So thanks, Vincent, for that.
Yeah.
So welcome everyone and to this session of the MIDIB webinar. And I'm gonna, without further ado, immediately ask Professor Vincent Latour of the University of Toulouse to introduce today's speaker for everyone. Thanks, Vincent.
Yeah. Thank you, Omar. So, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to have you all with us today. Our speaker is Quôc-Dung. Quôc-Dung holds a PhD in comparative British civilization from Université Sorbonne Nouvelle, which he defended in 2023 under the supervision of Professor Romain Garbaille. And the title of the PhD was Chinatown, a Western Brand, a comparative study of London's Chinatown and of the Quartier Asiatique de Paris. So this book, importantly, is under a contract with Routledge, and it will be published in 2028. So we're all very impatient to read it in a new version. And so really, I think we can start now. So Quôc-Dung, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Vincent Latour. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for joining this webinar. First of all, I want to thank Vincent Latour and Romain Garbaille for having me today and for giving me the opportunity to present my work. So my name is Quôc-Dung and I hold a PhD in contemporary British studies from Sorbonne Nouvelle University. And my research looks at the representation of ethnic minorities and more broadly at questions of integration, local public policy, and how cities organize and mobilize diversity in everyday space. So, as mentioned by Vincent Latour, my doctoral research was a comparative study of two Asian neighborhoods in Europe, London's Chinatown and the Asian neighborhood in Paris. But today, I'm not going to do the full comparison. I'm going to focus on the London case only because it offers a particularly striking example of something I call local multiculturalism. The idea that multicultural governance can remain strong locally, even when multiculturalism is said to be in decline nationally. So the title of my talk today is Local Multiculturalism, the Governance of London's Chinatown under the Conservative Westminster City Council. And the big question I want to explore is if multiculturalism is over at the national level, if it's criticized, allegedly abandoned, or even declared failure, then why do we still see local governments actively preserving, curating, and promoting multicultural policies in the urban core? And here is how I will structure the talk today with three parts. And I will clearly signpost when I move from one to the next. First, I will give very briefly the national context from multiculturalism to national cohesion. So what multiculturalism meant in Britain historically and why it became contested, especially from the late 1990s into the early 2000s. Second, we go local. I will show what governing Chinatown actually meant in practice by focusing on key policy documents, for example, the Chinatown Action Plan and other strategic policies that followed. And third, I will zoom in on Westminster politics, how the borough's long conservative dominance matters here. And this part will address what I see as the central question of this presentation. How can a long-standing conservative local authority continue to implement and sustain policies that appear, at least on the surface, to be multicultural? So before I start part one, just one quick note on evidence. My approach here is document-based and policy-focused because I rely heavily on official local documents from Westminster City Council, planning heritage texts, as well as landlord documents from the major property owner of Chinatown. And I also connect these local materials to national political texts that reframe multiculturalism in the 2000s. So let's move to part one, national context from multiculturalism to cohesion and shared values. In Britain, the word multiculturalism can be confusing because it's used in different ways. Sometimes it means a model of integration, sometimes a set of policies, sometimes just a description of diversity in society. Historically, British multicultural policy debates emerged strongly in the post-war period, with mass immigration from former colonies and the political challenge of combating discrimination while managing diversity in major cities. A key building block here was the race relations legislation, starting with the Race Relations Act in 1965, which is often described as the first UK law prohibiting racial discrimination in public places and criminalizing incitement to racial hatred. Now, one statement becomes very important in the British story. In the 1960s, Roy Jenkins, who was then the Secretary of the Home Office, famously framed integration not as assimilation, but as equal opportunity combined with cultural diversity and mutual tolerance. So we find this formulation repeated in parliamentary debate and later commentary, and it becomes a kind of reference point for a liberal and pluralist approach to integration. So very broadly, you can think of multiculturalism in Britain as having two pillars. First, anti-discrimination frameworks, legal equality and protection, and second, the local and institutional recognition of minority cultural identities, often strongest at city level and in local governance. But this model starts to face stronger controversy from the late 1990s onwards. There are many reasons, but a major turning point is 2001. After riots in northern English towns, policy debates focus intensely on segregation, the lack of interaction between groups, and the fear that ethnic communities are living in separate social worlds. The key text here is the community cohesion agenda, especially the 2001 report produced by the independent review team chaired by Ted Cantle. And the report is often summarized by the phrase parallel lives, the idea that communities can live alongside each other with limited, meaningful interaction, which then becomes framed as a risk for social cohesion. And notice what happens conceptually. The debate moves away from how do we recognize cultural difference and protect minorities towards how do we produce cohesion, shared values, and a sense of common belonging. In other words, diversity is no longer just celebrated, it becomes something that must be actively managed and integrated into a shared national framework. Now fast forward to the early 2010s. Across Europe, major political leaders increasingly perform a rhetorical break with multiculturalism. In 2010, for example, Angela Merkel is widely reported declaring that the multicultural approach had failed. And in early 2011, Nicolas Sarkozy also reported denouncing multiculturalism as a failure. In Britain, the best known speech in that moment is David Cameron at the Munich Security Conference in February 2011, where he argues that state multiculturalism has encouraged segregation and has failed to provide a strong vision of society to which people want to belong. And this is also where he calls for a more muscular liberalism and a stronger emphasis on shared national identity. So if we summarize this period from the early 2000s onwards, the national climate becomes increasingly suspicious of multiculturalism as a framework. Cohesion, integration, and shared values become the preferred vocabulary. Now, here's the key move in my argument. Even if multiculturalism is rhetorically declining nationally, that does not mean multicultural spaces are disappearing locally. In fact, in global cities, especially in central tourist destinations, ethnic neighborhoods can become even more central to the city's economic and symbolic strategies. And that brings us to part two, the local case. And now we will move from national discourse to local governance. And before discussing governance, it is important to briefly say a few words about the history of our case study here, London's Chinatown, because this helps us understand why it later became an object of urban regeneration. So London's first Chinatown was not located in Soho, but in the East End, in Limehouse, as you can see here, in the early 20th century. And it developed around the docks and was mainly inhabited by Chinese sailors and workers. However, this first Chinatown declined after the Second World War because of the destruction of the docks and broader urban restructuring. So from the 1950s onwards, a new Chinatown gradually emerged in Soho in the West End of London. And this area offered relatively cheap rent at that time and was already associated with nightlife and entertainment. And so it attracted new waves of migrants, particularly from Hong Kong, and they opened new restaurants and small businesses there. So unlike some other ethnic neighborhoods, Chinatown in London was not originally planned. It developed organically as a commercial and cultural hub centered around food, leisure, and services rather than residential life. By the 1980s, the area had gained official recognition as Chinatown by Westminster City Council, and symbolic elements such as Chinese gates, street decorations were introduced. However, despite this recognition, the area remained relatively neglected in terms of urban policy for many years. By the late 1990s, several problems had become increasingly visible. Issues of cleanliness, safety, and general urban decline, as well as growing pressure from surrounding commercial activities in the West End. Now, if we fast forward to the early 2000s, and this is where things begin to change quite significantly, Chinatown starts to be seen not just as an ethnic enclave, but as a strategic urban space, both culturally and economically. Geographically, it is located in the heart of the West End, very close to major tourist and entertainment zones such as Leicester Square and Soho. It is a relatively small area, but with very high visibility and foot traffic. So it plays a dual role. On the one hand, it is connected to Chinese and East Asian community life, providing cultural, commercial, and social services. And on the other hand, it functions as a major leisure and tourist destination, attracting visitors from London and beyond. Now, from a governance perspective, Chinatown is not simply there, it is actively produced, managed, and curated through a range of policy instruments. And before going further, it is important to briefly say a few words about the institution behind these policies, which is Westminster City Council. Westminster City Council is the local authority responsible for governing one of the most central and strategic areas of London, including the West End, Soho, and major political and commercial districts. And because of this, it plays a key role in urban planning, tourism management, and economic development in the capital. Now, if we come back to Chinatown, the early 2000s represent a turning point. This is the moment when the area begins to be treated as a specific object of urban policy rather than simply an organic ethnic neighborhood. The first major document is the Chinatown Action Plan, developed around 2003 as part of Westminster broader action plan approach in the West End. The council described this approach as an experimental model, first implemented in Leicester Square before being extended to other areas. And Chinatown was selected as the next priority site, which already tells us something important. It had become a strategic urban space in need of intervention. The action plan is very revealing because it shows the practical agenda behind preserving Chinatown. It opens with a very promotional description. It frames Chinatown as a central, bustling district, a focal point for Chinese and East and Southeast Asian culture, and a destination that contributes to London's world-class identity. But immediately after that celebratory tone, the document becomes extremely concrete, almost managerial. It lists pressures that the area faces. It mentions roughly 80 restaurants producing around 2,300 tons of waste annually, and it links the area's late night busyness to antisocial behavior, crime, and problems around lighting and cleanliness, especially in streets like Lime Street. So it also expresses fear of a loss of identity. The text warns that Chinatown's local businesses may face competition from what it calls mega bars, clubs, and coffee chains that have no traditional Chinese attributes. In other words, identity is described here as fragile asset that can be eroded by the West End nightlife economy and by chain brand expansion. Then the action plan lays out proposals across themes like identity, cleansing, safety, public realm, community services, and enforcement. What is interesting here is that multicultural identity is not only promoted through cultural symbols such as gates or festivals here, it is also managed through very concrete urban tools such as CCTV, policing, lighting, and strict cleaning regulations. In other words, diversity is not only celebrated, it's also carefully controlled and organized. And the action plan also makes the governance structure explicit. It was developed with a Chinese community liaison officer and in consultation with multiple stakeholders, including London Chinatown Chinese Association, the Metropolitan Police Service, and the major landlord, Shaftesbury Capital, that I will talk about in later. So the policy is explicitly drawn as a partnership arrangement. Now, I want to underline the document is not just symbolic. It had a very a quite practical delivery framing. In the cabinet report attached to the plan, the council states that the draft action plan identified over 80 actions and that 36 were underway or will be completed by the end of the consultation period. And according to a later council summary, consultation on the draft plan generated over 400 responses, which tells you that this was treated as a significant local policy progress, not just a branding leaflet. So that's the action plan. a blend of cultural celebration, risk management, and improvements to the visitor experience, implemented through partnership governance. The second document is the Chinatown Economic Development Study, published in 2004. And this report is particularly important because it makes the economic logic of Chinatown's regeneration much more explicit. The study assesses Chinatown's economic, social, and cultural position within the West End, and it highlights a number of structural vulnerabilities. In particular, it describes the area as being in a relatively fragile state, both in terms of its economic sustainability and its identity. What is especially interesting here is the way the report frames Chinatown in market terms. It emphasized that the area has a specific, unique selling point, which is precisely its Chinese and Asian character. However, it also warns that this identity could be threatened by the arrival of non-Asian and non-Chinese businesses, particularly larger corporate actors that are able to pay higher rents. At the same time, the study notes that a very large proportion of businesses in Chinatown, around 90%, are tenants rather than property owners, and this makes them particularly vulnerable to rising rents and market pressures. So what we see here is a very clear shift. Chinatown is no longer understood only as a cultural or community space, but increasingly as an economic asset that needs to be managed, protected, and optimized within a competitive urban market. The third governance tool is heritage designation. And Chinatown here became a conservation area in 2005. And now, why does this matter politically? Because conservation area status creates extra planning, controls, and conservation duties. In principle, these tools are about protecting architectural and historic character. But Chinatown shows how heritage frameworks can also protect a cultural landscape, a streetscape marked by specific signs, colors, gateways, and symbolic markers that communicate Chineseness in the center of the city. So Westminster's own conservation area overview explicitly describes Chinatown's streetscape as characterized by ornament, bright color, and Chinese characters, with gateways that define the experience of entering a distinct character area. Now, if we move on to the next stage, we can look at the 2008 design strategy, which was developed in partnership with the Prince's Foundation for the Built Environment. This document is particularly interesting because it introduces what I would describe as an almost theatrical approach to urban planning, and this tone is already visible in the foreword written by Charles III, who states, and I quote, "Let's make Chinatown the best Chinatown in the world." So from the very beginning, the ambition is clearly not just local, it is also global and competitive. Now, if we look at the content of this document, what we find is a very detailed set of design prescriptions. It specifies, for example, which colors should be used, how facades should be designed, what kinds of lighting schemes are appropriate, how signage should look, and even the style of street furniture. So we are dealing here with a very precise attempt to standardize the visual identity of the neighborhood, and this is where the analysis becomes interesting, because this is not simply about celebrating culture. What we see here is a process of curation. In other words, the council is effectively creating a visual script of Chineseness, which is carefully designed, controlled, and reproduced in the urban space of central London. And this process goes even further with the 2009 supplementary planning guidance, which is a crucial document, because at this stage, what was previously a set of recommendations becomes embedded into the planning system. In practical terms, this means that any modification to the built environment, for example, shop fronts, signage, or facades, must now comply with the official defined Chinatown identity. So we move from designer guidance to regulatory enforcement, and this is a key moment in the governance of Chinatown, because cultural aesthetics are no longer just encouraged; they are effectively institutionalized and regulated through urban planning policy. Another important dimension of Chinatown's governance is the organization of cultural festivals, and in particular the celebration of Chinese New Year, or Lunar New Year. And each year, Westminster City Council, together with the Greater London Authority, co-organizes what is often described as the largest Chinese Lunar New Year celebration in Europe. And the event includes traditional lion dances, stage performances, large-scale fireworks, often in Trafalgar Square, official speeches by mayors and councillors, and extensive media coverage, often framed around the idea of London celebrating diversity. Now, what is particularly interesting here is not just the cultural content of the event, but its political and symbolic function. Because during these celebrations, Chinatown and more broadly central London becomes what we might call a civic stage, a space where the city quite literally performs its multicultural identity. So for a few hours, London presents itself as inclusive, harmonious, and culturally diverse. Different communities are symbolically brought together under a shared narrative of unity through diversity. Before moving to the political evolution of Westminster, I would like to briefly introduce another key actor in the governance of Chinatown, which is Shaftesbury Capital. Because if we only look at the local authority, we are missing a crucial part of the picture. Shaftesbury is the dominant property owner in Chinatown. They control a very large proportion of the commercial real estate, estimated between 70% and 80% of the area, and this fundamentally shapes how the neighborhood operates. Shaftesbury approach is very much economic and strategic. The company treats Chinatown as an investment, also a brand and a commercial ecosystem. And to describe this, I use the concept of productive multiculturalism, that is, using cultural difference as economic value, turning identity into a marketable resource, and transforming the neighborhood into a profitable ethnic village, as they call it. Shaftesbury's involvement in Chinatown goes back to the late 1980s. And interestingly, during the 1990s recession, they observed something quite revealing. While other areas of the West End, such as Soho, were struggling at that time, Chinatown remained consistently busy. As one of the directors later put it, he said, and I quote, "In the middle of the property crash, nobody went bust in Chinatown." So, from that moment on, Chinatown was no longer an ethnic neighborhood. It became what we might call a resilient niche market, in other words, an asset. And over the following decades, Shaftesbury progressively acquired more properties until it effectively gained control over most of the neighborhood. Now, what is particularly interesting is how this ownership translates into control over the identity of the area. Shaftesbury manages Chinatown by carefully controlling the tenant mix. For a long time, there was an informal but very clear principle. Businesses had to contribute to the Asian or Chinese identity of the neighborhood. So non-Asian brands, non-Asian businesses, even very profitable ones, were often excluded because they were seen as damaging the authenticity of the area. So what we see here is a form of curated authenticity and very racialized approach. Ethnicity becomes not just a cultural feature, but a commercial criterion. At the same time, this authenticity is not fixed. In the 2010s, Shaftesbury actively modernized Chinatown by introducing new Asian food trends. So we've got, for example, bubble tea, hot pot chains, Korean barbecue, Japanese desserts, and also the regional Chinese cuisines. And these were often inspired by trends in other Southeast Asian countries. So Chinatown evolves into a pan-Asian foodscape, and it was designed to appeal to global consumers, which leads to an important point. Authenticity here is not simply preserved; it is also adapted and reshaped according to market demand. Now, what is important for our argument is that this private strategy does not operate in isolation. It is closely aligned with the policies of Westminster City Council. So at this stage, we can see there is what we can see is a clear alignment between public policy and private investment, with Westminster City Council and Shaftesbury working together to shape Chinatown as both a cultural and economic space. But this raises an important question. Westminster has been dominated by the Conservative Party for decades, a political tradition that is not usually associated with strong support for multiculturalism. So how can we explain the fact that a conservative local authority has played such an active role in promoting and managing an ethnic neighborhood like Chinatown? And this is precisely what I would like to explore in the next part: Westminster conservatism, conservative governance, and neoliberal urban logic. To understand Chinatown governance, we need to understand Westminster as a political institution. The borough and its council were created under the London Government Act in 1963, with the first elections held in 1964, and the authority coming fully into power in 1965. What's striking is Westminster's political continuity from the first elections in 1964 until 2022. The Conservatives controlled the council, and Labour took control for the first time only in 2022. One number matters for our Chinatown story. In 2002, the moment when the Chinatown Action Plan was being developed, Westminster had a strong Conservative majority, 48 Conservative seats versus 12 Labour seats in the council's results summary. So how can a long-standing Conservative local authority sustain and even reinforce practices that resemble multicultural governance despite a broader national shift away from multiculturalism? So let me begin with the first explanation, which is the broader transformation of urban governance through the rise of neoliberalism. If we look at the British context, we can identify three main phases. First, what we might call the pre-neoliberal era from the 1940s to the 1970s. And during this period, cities were governed within a Keynesian welfare state framework, where local authorities played a central role in housing provision, urban planning, and social services. Then from the 1980s onwards, we enter what is often described as a phase of rollback neoliberalism under Margaret Thatcher. And this phase is characterized by privatization, deregulation, and a reduction of direct state in intervention. In urban policy, this led to the creation of institutions such as the the Urban Development Corporations or the City Challenge program, which shifted power away from local authorities and towards more market-oriented forms of governance. And from the 1990s onwards, this evolved into a second phase, often described as a rollout neoliberalism, particularly under Tony Blair. And here the state does not withdraw, but instead reconfigures its role. Local authorities here increasingly develop partnerships with private actors, engage in strategic urban planning, and actively promote economic development.
Sorry to interrupt you, Quôc-Dung. Is it possible for you to speak closer to your mic? I mean, we have problems. I can hear spluttering on my side for some reason. Thank you.
Is it clear? Is it clearer now?
Yes, it's better. Thank you.
Okay. So in this context, neoliberal urbanism can be understood as the progressive commodification of urban space and the transformation of cities into profit-generating environments. As some scholars have argued, cities become sites of market-oriented growth, but also spaces of control and regulation, particularly over marginalized populations. In other words, the role of local government fundamentally changes. It is no longer simply managing the city, but it is actively producing and organizing urban space in ways that support economic competitiveness. Now, this is exactly how we should understand the case of Westminster City Council, because Westminster does not simply support Chinatown in a cultural or social sense. It governs Chinatown as an economic and strategic space. Through its policies, the council regulates the built environment. The council also defines aesthetic and spatial norms, and it also structures the area as a consumption oriented destination. And at the same time, it relies on partnerships with private actors such as Shaftesbury Capital to finance and implement these transformations. So what we see in Westminster is not a retreat of the state, but a transformation of its role from provider to strategic organizer of urban space within a neoliberal framework. Now, the second explanation is closely linked to what we have just discussed, but it brings us to a much more concrete level. It concerns the financial role of private capital, and more specifically, the relationship between Westminster City Council and Shaftesbury Capital. What is important here is that this relationship is not balanced. It is, in fact, an asymmetrical partnership. There are two main reasons for this. First, because Shaftesbury owns the majority of the properties in Chinatown, and it effectively controls the commercial ecosystem of the area. And this has very concrete implications. While the council can regulate, for example, planning permissions, land use, and urban design, it cannot control who actually operates the businesses. In other words, the council can decide what type of activity is allowed, but not who runs it. And this gives Shaftesbury a decisive role in shaping, controlling the cultural and ethnic composition of Chinatown. And second, even more importantly, there is a clear financial dependence. Because despite the ambitions of Westminster's action plans, the council simply does not have the resources to implement them on its own. So the situation became particularly acute after the 2008 crisis and the austerity policies that followed. As a result, many projects that fall in principle within the remit of public authorities are actually financed by Shaftesbury. For example, we have the redevelopment of Newport Place, or other improvements to Charing Street and Wardour Street, even the installation of the CCTV systems in London, in Chinatown to enhance security in the area. In its own report, Shaftesbury explicitly presents itself as funding and transforming the public realm. For instance, the creation of a semi-pedestrianised space, allowing new forms of consumption, such as outdoor dining. So what we see here is something quite revealing. Urban governance is no longer purely public. It becomes a form of public-private co-production, in which the council provides the regulatory framework, but private capital provides the means of implementation. And this is a concrete example of neoliberal urban governance, because what defines this model is precisely the reliance on private investment, the shift of traditional public functions to private actors, and the alignment of urban development with consumption, tourism, and economic performance. Now, a third explanation lies in the specific position of London as a global city. The concept of global city, developed by scholars such as Saskia Sassen, refers to cities that play a central role in the global economy. And these are cities that concentrate financial and economic power, attract international investment, and function as hubs of global flows of capital, people, and culture. And now this position has a very concrete implications for how cities are governed. Global cities are not only economic centers, they are also in competition with one another for tourists, for investors, for international visibility, and symbolic prestige. As a result, local governments in global cities place a strong emphasis on city branding, cultural attractiveness, and the projection of a cosmopolitan image. And this is precisely where Chinatown becomes strategically important, because it is not just a neighborhood or a community space. It is globally recognizable urban form. And in that sense, Chinatown contributes directly to London's global image, its attractiveness as a destination, and its positioning within the hierarchy of global cities. So, from this perspective, supporting Chinatown is not about multicultural ideology, it is also about maintaining London's status as a global city. Now, a fourth and final explanation, and closely related to the idea of London as a global city, lies in the broader urban context of the 2000s, and more specifically in the preparation for the London 2012 Olympic Games. Now, of course, most of the large scale regeneration projects associated with the Olympics were concentrated in East London. However, what is important here is not only the geography of these projects, but the broader urban dynamic they created. The Olympic bid, and later the preparation phase, triggered a citywide effort to enhance London's international image and improve its urban environment and present the city as modern, dynamic, cosmopolitan, and above all multicultural. And these broader contexts also affected central areas such as the West End. Even if Westminster was not directly responsible for Olympic infrastructure, it was very much part of this wider effort to showcase London to the world. And in this context, spaces like Chinatown take on a particular importance because they contribute to projecting an image of cultural diversity, international openness, and urban vibrancy. So what we see here is that Chinatown is not only shaped by local policies or private investment, it is also embedded in a wider moment in which London is actively constructing its image as a global and multicultural city. And in that sense, promoting Chinatown fits perfectly within broader Olympic mood of the 2000s, as part of London's global identity. So, to conclude, rather than seeing Chinatown as an exception, I would suggest that it should be understood as a symptom of broader transformation. And what this case reveals is not simply the persistence of multiculturalism, but a shift in its function. In contemporary cities, diversity is no longer primarily framed as a question of rights or recognition. Not only, it is increasingly embedded in the logics of urban governance, economic strategy, and spatial management. And this is where the case of Westminster becomes particularly revealing, because it shows that even within a conservative political framework, one that is often critical of multiculturalism at the national level, diversity can still be actively produced and maintained as long as it aligns with economic interests, urban attractiveness, and the global positioning of the city. So what we are observing here is not the disappearance of multiculturalism, but its displacement from a political project to a governance tool. And in that sense, Chinatown is not just a neighborhood, it is a space where culture is curated, identity is structured, and diversity is made legible, visible, and consumable. So perhaps the question is no longer whether multiculturalism survives, but how it is reshaped and to what ends in the contemporary city. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much for an excellent presentation. And I'm sure there'll be plenty of questions from the floor.
Yes, I have one.
Okay, you go
If
ahead.
nobody else, let's see first.
Okay,
Don't hesitate. Don't be shy if you have questions.
go ahead, Romain.
Well, oh, Jade put her hand up. Go ahead, Jade, if you want.
Can you remind me of the theoretical concept regarding Pan-Asianness in Chinatown? You used a specific term, but I forgot about it.
Sorry, could you say that again?
Can you remind me of the theoretical concept? There's a specific name you used when you mentioned the Pan-Asianness of Chinatown. I don't remember what it was.
Yeah, so the term I was referring to is what I describe as a form of Pan-Asian identity of Chinatown. So what I mean by that is the shift from a historically more Chinese and often Cantonese identity to a broader and more hybrid Asian identity, which now includes Korean, Japanese, Vietnamese, Thai, and other influences. And this transformation is not accidental, as I mentioned. It is largely driven by commercial and strategic considerations. In other words, Chinatown is no longer just representing a specific community, which was the Cantonese community from Hong Kong, but it's increasingly curated as a Pan-Asian consumption space, which was designed by Shaftesbury and Westminster to appeal to a wider and more global audience. So did I answer the...
Yeah, pretty much. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks. Can I jump in now, perhaps, if nobody else wants to jump in? Quôc-Dung, as usual, I greatly appreciated your conference. I thought it was great.
Thank you.
It taught me a lot. I was particularly impressed, of course, by the recurring theme of competition that I think crops up all along the presentation at various points, because we understand, as your conclusion very nicely sums up, multiculturalism in this context now is not understood just as, or not even as a question of rights or recognition, as a question of as a kind of asset in a global competition, in the global economy, and the competition for the branding of global cities and making global cities like London attractive, I guess, if I understood correctly. And what I want to ask you specifically about is the first time this notion of competition appears. So we see it recurring several times. We see it in when I think Prince Charles gets involved, which I think is a fascinating issue in itself. The relation between the monarchy, Prince Charles, then who becomes king, and Chinatown. There's already a lot of material in your thesis about that, but I think it's an idea you could push further in the future. But he talks about competition, I think, in some way, if I remember well the slide. And then Boris Johnson, when he's at the annual Chinese festival, yeah, the Chinese New Year, he's also making a speech that says this is part of what London is one of the best places to celebrate the Chinese New Year's. Yeah.
Yes.
So there's also, and this, well, my question is about the first time in your presentation I saw this idea of competition is back, I think, in 2003. Maybe I'm mistaken about the date, but at the very beginning of your narrative, when what the very first document that you showed us from the Westminster City Council explains or seems to explain that it's important to shore up, to defend, to celebrate Chinatown's Asian or Chinese / or Pan-Asian, I don't know, identity, in to make sure it doesn't get sort of crowded, overwhelmed, threatened by the club and bar culture of Soho, which is right next door. And I thought that was extremely interesting because, after all, this clubbing and bar and pub culture is also very much part of the attractivity of that part of London. So there's this kind of strategic choice to make sure that Chinatown can thrive. Maybe because there's, I don't know. So that's my question: were there too many bars? Was there too much club culture? Is that associated to the gay image of the neighborhood? Which I think would seem to me is something that is of high value now, but I'm not sure it was at the time. So, do you have any more information on that? Or
Thank you. That's a really insightful question, and I think you're absolutely right to highlight this recurring notion of competition. What I would say is that the type of competition we are dealing with here is not simply a competition between good and bad urban uses or between Chinese and non-Chinese spaces. It is more a question of how different parts of the city are positioned within a broader strategy of urban differentiation. So when Westminster expresses concern in the early 2000s about the expansion of Soho's bar and club culture into Chinatown, the issue is not that nightlife is undesirable, as you rightly pointed out. It's actually a key part of London's attractiveness. The issue is rather that this type of activity risks blurring the identity of Chinatown. And so in a context of global urban competition, what becomes crucial is not just attractiveness in general, but also differentiated attractiveness. In other words, each area had to maintain a recognizable and marketable identity. So Soho can function as a nightlife district, while Chinatown is positioned as a cultural and culinary destination. And so the role of the council is precisely to manage these boundaries in order to prevent what we might call a kind of functional overlap. I don't know, that would weaken the branding of both spaces. So I would say that this is not a contradiction, but rather a form of intra-urban competition and segmentation, where different urban identities are strategically
yeah.
to maximize the overall attractiveness
Yes, I understand that we're talking about competition in two different meanings at two different levels. There's the global competition between competing global cities, and then in the early 2000s, I was more thinking in terms of competition between neighborhoods. But of course, as you say, it shouldn't be viewed as competition between neighborhoods. They're all complementary and they're all part of Westminster Council's strategy of attractiveness. But still, there was an issue about making sure that one was not overshadowing or as overlapping too much with the other. So maybe not competition then, but making sure that the neighborhood branding, each of the neighborhoods, the clubbing and bar and going out district was kept distinct from the Chinatown area. If I understood, that's what you've just been saying. So I think it's interesting that the Westminster Council felt the need to intervene politically to make sure, I mean, in terms of urban planning, to make sure that these distinct, complementary in terms of attractiveness, but distinct still, culturally distinct in terms of branding, could be kept autonomous from each other and clearly demarcated in terms of territory.
Mm.
So that's what I think very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions? I have one potentially, but I wouldn't like to restrain anyone or to prevent anyone from talking. But maybe just if you allow me, first a remark. So thanks again for a wonderful presentation, and which made me think why I appreciated so much your thesis when I read it and the rest of your work. You mentioned in the first part of your talk, which is centered on developments, historical developments, notably in the 2000s. You mentioned community cohesion, right, which was then promoted by New Labour. Interestingly, although community cohesion to a certain extent survived locally, it was abandoned at the national level by the coalition. I think the last minister that had a community cohesion portfolio, a junior minister, was in 2012, and after that it was phased out nationally. Interestingly, now the concept has been revived by the Starmer government, and it appears explicitly actually in a policy paper which was published earlier this month, entitled Protecting What Matters Towards a More Confident, Cohesive and Resilient United Kingdom, which I read last weekend, and in which the phrase community cohesion appears 7 times. And so I think there's a renewal of that concept. And I don't think it's contradictory with what you were saying, that is the survival of multiculturalism. I think that community cohesion is in a way another version of multiculturalism, which actually promotes a certain number of shared values. And there have been a series of versions of multiculturalism since the 1980s. The first one was probably more centered on anti-racism, and now there are other elements that come into play. So I just wanted to highlight that point. And then I had a question about really the third part of your paper, that is the dominance of conservatives in Westminster. And I wanted to know whether this had materialized by the emergence of local Asian conservative politicians. When I mean Asian, I mean Chinese, really, because the Conservative Party has been characterized by the emergence of Asian politicians, Rishi Sunak being obviously, or Priti Patel being, the most famous ones. But what about the Chinese community in London? Have they participated in the management of Westminster, as conservative politicians locally, or not? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much both for your comment and for the question. I completely agree with your point on community cohesion. I think it's a very useful way of thinking about the evolution of multiculturalism. Not as a disappearance, but as a series of reconfigurations over time. And regarding your question about the presence of Asian and more specifically Chinese conservative politicians at the local level, this is actually a very interesting point, because based on my research, there is no strong evidence of a significant emergence of Chinese conservative political representation within Westminster City Council in relation to Chinatown governance. In fact, it seems more important in this case, it's not so much political representation, but rather the role of institutional and economic actors. So as I said, the governance of Chinatown appears to rely much more on local councillors acting as intermediaries, business associations, and especially private actors such as Shaftesbury Capital. So rather than a model based on political incorporation or representation, what we observe is a form of governance driven by economic interests, urban planning strategies, and public-private partnerships. So here we can say maybe that the Chinese community is present, but not necessarily as a politically mobilized or institutionally represented group within the conservative structure of the council. And this actually reinforces one of my earlier points, that Chinatown is governed less as a political community and more as an economic and symbolic. So I would say that in this case, the key driver is not political representation, but rather the alignment between local governance and economic actors within a broader urban framework. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, that's fine. Absolutely fine. Thank you very much.
Makes sense.
I just had memories of more Chinese or other Asian politicians being involved in Paris in this. Yes.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Okay. In Paris, we have Wang, who was very active in promoting the neighborhood, for example.
I don't know about the very recent municipal elections in Paris, and I don't know about the involvement of local Chinese politicians, but I remember, you're saying in your thesis, yes. Do we have other questions from the floor or remarks? Well, if not, we may, I guess, call it today. And thank you very much for your presence. We would just like to say that the next session of our webinar will be held in June, precisely on the 8th of June 2026. And it will be chaired by Annelle Prugnot, actually from Université Mont Blanc, who defended a thesis in December 2025. It's very recent. And the title of the presentation, in line with the theme of a comparative thesis, will be comparing the evolutions of governmental discourse and national identity in the UK and in France in the 21st century, a convergence on migration, security, and muscular liberalism, ? So we're all looking forward to that presentation. And we thank you again very much for your presence and your participation in the webinar. Thank you again, obviously, Quôc-Dung, for a brilliant presentation, and we all look forward to reading your book.
Yes. One last remark for the students of my M1 seminar who are here. Just a brief reminder, you might have seen, but on your eCampus page, you've got the precise dates and references that Vincent has just given for the next presentation in June. So you're ready to. You just have to click on the link to come back and participate in this event with us in June.
Thank you again very much. And I think I may now stop